The most powerful pharaohs of ancient Egypt weren't Egyptian. They invaded from the south. For centuries, Egypt was ruled by pharaohs from the Nile Valley. But what happens when the rulers come from somewhere else? South of Egypt, along the Nile, another kingdom was rising, and this was no empty frontier. At its center stood Napata, where Kush controlled wealth, trade, and the Nile routes connecting Africa to Egypt. Gold flowed north. And while Kush grew stronger, Egypt was beginning to fracture. Different rulers controlled different parts of the country. And for Kush, Egypt's division created an opportunity. But the Kushites did not begin by conquering all of Egypt. The first step was influence. Kushite influence was already reaching deeper into Egypt. But northern Egypt was not ready to surrender. A coalition of Egyptian rulers challenged the growing power from the south. Eventually, the challenge reached the court of Piye. When Piye learned that the northern rulers were challenging Kushite influence, he did not wait for the conflict to reach his own kingdom. He ordered his forces north. This was not a raid. The Nile became the road to war. The rulers of the north did not simply open their gates. Piye's forces began taking the cities that stood in their path. One by one, the northern rulers were forced to reconsider their position. At the center of the resistance was Tefnakt of Sais. But the coalition against Piye began to fracture. The Kushite army continued north. Ahead stood Memphis. Memphis was not just another city. It was one of the great symbols of Egyptian power. Piye's forces surrounded the city. And the resistance began to collapse. Piye had reached the heart of Egypt. But conquering Egypt was one thing. Ruling it was another. Egypt was not held together by armies alone. To rule Egypt, Piye had to become more than a conqueror. He had to present himself as the rightful ruler of Egypt. And the story of his victory was carved into stone. Piye was not simply claiming that he had won a war. He was presenting himself as the legitimate king of a united Egypt. Then Piye returned south to Napata. But the Kushite conquest did not end with Piye. His successor, Shabaka, strengthened Kushite control over Egypt. The dynasty was no longer simply expanding. It was building a political system that connected Egypt and Kush. The dynasty continued through a succession of Kushite rulers. For a time, the Kushite dynasty looked firmly established. But beyond Egypt, a much larger power was expanding. And eventually, Kushite Egypt would stand directly in its path. By the time Taharqa became pharaoh, the Kushite dynasty had reached the height of its power. He was not only a warrior. He invested in temples, monuments, and the institutions that held the kingdom together. But far to the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was becoming one of the most powerful forces in the ancient world. And Assyria was moving closer. Egypt was no longer just a kingdom to defend. It was the gateway between Africa and the Near East. The first pressure did not necessarily begin with a direct invasion of Egypt. The struggle first played out across the Levant. And Taharqa became involved in a conflict that was much larger than the Nile Valley. And when kingdoms in the Levant resisted, Egypt became involved. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon eventually turned his army directly toward Egypt. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian army invaded Egypt. The Kushite grip on Egypt was suddenly under direct attack. Taharqa resisted. But Assyria was not a small rival. For a moment, it looked as if Assyria had won. But the war was not over. Taharqa died, but the dynasty did not disappear with him. A new Kushite king now had a choice. Taharqa claimed that a dream had shown him the path forward. And he moved north. The southern king was coming back for Egypt. The Egyptian resistance collapsed faster than Assyria expected. Taharqa reached Memphis, and the Kushites regained control of the city. The kingdom that had seemed defeated had returned. Now Assyria had a problem. The Assyrians could not simply allow Egypt to slip away again. The counterattack was devastating. In 663 BCE, Thebes was sacked. Taharqa retreated south, and Kushite rule over Egypt was finally broken. The Kushite kings had lost Egypt. But that did not mean Kush had disappeared. The center of Kushite power moved back toward the south. From there, the Kushite kingdom continued. Meanwhile, Egypt entered a new political era. The political balance of the Nile Valley had changed. In Egypt, a new dynasty eventually emerged. Psamtik I would eventually establish the 26th dynasty. So was the Kushite conquest of Egypt a failure? If the goal was to rule Egypt forever, then no. But if the goal was to prove that Kush could challenge the greatest powers of the ancient world, then the answer is very different. For generations, rulers from Kush sat on the throne of Egypt. They restored temples, built monuments, and reshaped the political history of the Nile Valley. And the name Black Pharaohs became attached to one of the most powerful chapters in the history of ancient Egypt. They did not come from the north to imitate Egypt. They came from the south, and for a time, they ruled it. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe to support more history content.